There's a lot we don't know, but what you do know is how the Justice Department works and what is required to get to this point, which is unprecedented as far as I know. Give us a sense of what the standard is that prosecutors would have to come up with in order to go forward to seek a search warrant against a former president of the United States.
Well, of course, in general, for any search warrant, you need to have probable cause of criminality and probable cause to believe that you're likely to find evidence with regard to that criminality at the place you're searching. But when you're dealing with a case like this involving a former president, the standard and the concern to get it right goes really through the roof. And I think we can be very certain that far different than a routine warrant where a couple of agents may draft up an affidavit and go to a judge in the night. This one was scrutinized every way from Sunday by people up to the top of the FBI and up to the top of the Department of Justice. So the care that went into this and the level of concern that had to be felt in order to make this happen is absolutely enormous. So I think it's almost impossible to understate the significance of this as a measure of where the minds of the department and the head of the FBI are at with regard to this investigation.
So going to the very top, Merrick Garland, quite correctly, the Attorney General has not commented. The Justice Department is not commenting on this at all. But do you have any doubt in your mind that Merrick Garland would have had to sign off on this?
No, I think there's not a doubt in the world that he and quite a number of others who know how to do this stuff have looked at it very, very carefully, and undoubtedly he had to play a role in signing off.
Now, on the other hand, Donald, some people have speculated that they wouldn't have done this without the White House knowing about it. But comment on that, because there is a tradition of some separation between the Attorney General and the President, some independence there that other cabinet officials don't have.
That's right. The President has the power to do pretty much anything he wants in terms of the way he runs the government. But the wise choices that had been made by nearly every president, one recent one probably accepted, but the choices have been made to leave that in the hands of the Department of Justice. The president doesn't want to be involved in things that will look like political choices about criminality, and he certainly doesn't want to be involved in making judgment calls about whether, what kind of investigation and whether to prosecute his predecessor. So my bet is that Joe Biden probably said he didn't want to know about what they're doing on this investigation, and I'd be surprised if he knew that about this before it happened.
Donald, there are other ways that a prosecutor can get information, particularly a grand jury. There have been reports of a grand jury looking into various events surrounding January 6th. A subpoena is available. You just formally request the information. What is the process within the Justice Department to say, subpoena is not good enough, we need to get a search warrant this time?
Well, you generally get a search warrant where you either don't have a way to serve a subpoena on anybody who could respond to it, or more likely in a lot of cases, you have no confidence at all that serving a subpoena will get a response, whether it be a direct subpoena or a grand jury subpoena. And so I think you have to believe that this was a kind of a last alternative that was arrived at because A, the urgency of getting whatever this information was, and B, the lack of any confidence that if you didn't do it in this way, coming in unannounced and simply intrude with a warrant in order to search the house, you probably wouldn't ever get the information. And I think that's probably why they did it here.
Now, it's important to focus on exactly who had to approve this. Obviously, as you suggest, maybe it went up as far as Merrick Garland, Attorney General, but a court has to review the request, do they not?
They do. Any search warrant has to be approved by a judge, and they're done, hundreds of times a day all across the country. But it's a very serious thing, and the judge has to review an affidavit that's put together with care in order to indicate, the probable cause of criminality and the probable cause to believe that it's more likely than not to believe that evidence related to that criminality will be found at the place where you are looking. So they had to spell out with some specificity why it was that evidence, whatever it is, of criminality would be found there. And then once you do that, whatever it is you find, it may in fact be things that are important evidence that end up relating to other points than the ones you looked at. All of that, having gotten a look at it and gotten to seize it legally, all of that becomes fair game with regard to the investigation.
Well, Donald, I want to go exactly to that point about getting things from a search warrant that could be used for a different offense than what perhaps you showed probable cause for. Because there's a lot of talk about the Presidential Records Act, which is a serious statute. You have to take it seriously. But would we go after the personal residence of a former president if ultimately we thought that the crime that you're investigating is the Presidential Records Act?
Well, I think you have to know how that Presidential Records Act issue fits in to any bigger picture. I mean, I think if what you were talking about was President Trump taking, a few records that were not classified of something that was sort of incidental to nothing in particular, the idea they would go and get a warrant to pursue it, I think is a non-starter. On the other hand, right now in the climate we're in, with all we know from the select committee hearings, the idea that these documents could relate directly to the events that the select committee hearings put on evidence about. In every one of those hearings, there was a lot of evidence of Donald Trump doing personally a whole lot of things. And there's every possibility that records exist reflecting communications of various kinds, memorializing things that happened, who knows? And so it could well tie up with that. I think that the thing that you have to recognize is that the ultimate judgment to go after a warrant like this, you can't do it unless you've got probable cause of the types required. But the idea that they would do it, even if they had that probable cause, absent a very high level of concern related to very serious criminal conduct, it's not something they would be likely to do, even if they had theoretically probable cause. So I think you got to believe that to go after a former president's home with a warrant, you have got to have the highest level of concern supporting and that essentially justified by the probable cause finding. And I think that's the judgment that is telling here. This tells you that the Justice Department and the FBI see a very big issue here, and they wouldn't have done this but for that.
And let's just spend just a moment, if we could, Donald, on probable cause and exactly what that standard is normally. I understand this might have been higher as a practical matter, but you don't have to prove your case to the judge, right?
Right. You need to have probable cause. Just means it's probably true. It's a preponderance burden. It means it's more likely than not. So you need evidence that shows it's probably true that criminality has been involved here. And you need to show that there's reason to think it's probably also true that evidence will be found relating to that. And you have to describe the kind of evidence to show the probable cause relationship to it. So it's a probability standard in order to get the warrant and make the search. It's not a beyond a reasonable doubt standard, but it's a pretty high standard, and it's especially high when you're focused on a personal place, like ultimately the sort of paradigmatic case is the home. The idea that there's history going back before the revolution of people being very concerned about their homes and their personal privacy and their documents being disrespected. And here we're right at the heart of that highest level of concern. So that there's a very great level of attention being given to this judgment.
One last quick one, Donald, and that is, as far as you know, is there a mental state required of the person who's accused of the crime under the presidential records? Does President Trump, if this all played out, does he have a defense of, I didn't know I was supposed to keep the documents?
I think it depends on what you're going to make the accusation of. And I know that there would never be any kind of a criminal proceeding brought absent of a flagrant intentionality related to this. You don't go around prosecuting former officials, whether they're the president or somebody else, because they incidentally took some document and weren't quite certain or aware that they had done it. So practically speaking, absolutely, there is that level of concern. But I think there's a decent likelihood here that the ultimate issues that we're tied up with here are ultimately, depending what's found, issues not just related to presidential records, but what are these records of, and what do they tell us, and how do they relate to the bigger picture of the very serious conduct of attempting to steal a national presidential election?